6 wives, 2 beheadings, 1 burning question. Who did the most notorious king in English history actually love most? You think you know the answer. Everyone does. Jane Seymour gave him his son. She's buried beside him at Windsor Castle. He called her his true wife. Case closed, right? Wrong. What if everything you've been told about Henry's favorite wife is built on assumptions? What if the king's own actions tell a completely different story? What if the woman who truly captured his heart wasn't the sweet, gentle mother of his heir? Henry VIII lived 3 lives. Young Henry, the romantic; middle Henry, the desperate king; old Henry, the dying tyrant. Each needed something different from love. But here's what nobody talks about. There was one wife who understood all 3 versions of Henry. This isn't the story you learned in school. This is the story Henry's own actions tell us. And by the end, you'll never think about the 6 wives the same way again. Let's start where everyone expects us to start, with the woman history claims was his favorite. Jane Seymour enters Henry's story like morning mist after a thunderstorm. Gentle, quiet, everything Anne Boleyn wasn't. May 1536. Anne's blood is still wet on Tower Green. 10 days later, Henry marries Jane in a private ceremony. No grand celebration, no months of courtship, just a king desperate for peace and a woman who promised to give it to him. Jane was perfect for what Henry needed right then. She didn't argue politics like Catherine of Aragon. She didn't challenge him like Anne Boleyn. She simply agreed, nodded, smiled, said yes to everything. The court loved her for it. After years of watching Henry tear England apart for Anne, Jane felt like blessed relief. She is peaceful, simple. But here's the thing about being simple. It leaves no room for surprise. Jane gave Henry what every queen before her had died wanting, a son. October 12, 1537. Prince Edward arrived after a difficult labor that lasted 3 days. Jane held her baby once, maybe twice. Then the fever took her. 12 days later, she was dead. Now, watch what Henry did next. This reveals everything. He gave Jane a queen's funeral, the most magnificent funeral any of his wives would receive. Princess Mary served as chief mourner. The entire court wore black for months. Henry himself retreated from public life, genuinely grief-stricken. When Henry designed his own tomb 10 years later, he chose to be buried beside Jane. Not beside Catherine, who had been his wife for 24 years. Not beside Anne, who had changed the course of English history for him. Beside Jane, the wife who had lived with him for just 16 months. Why? Because Jane never disappointed him. She died before she could fail at anything else. Think about it. Catherine had failed to give him sons. Anne had given him a daughter, then lost her temper, then lost her head. But Jane? Jane gave him Edward, then died before she could fail at anything else. Jane Seymour became perfect because she left before perfection could crack. And Henry's actions during his life tell a very different story about where his heart truly belonged. There was one wife Henry couldn't forget. One wife who made him do impossible things. One wife who changed not just his marriage, but his entire kingdom. That wife was Anne Boleyn.
Henry once wrote a letter that historians found centuries later. In it, he made a confession about love that changes everything we think we know about his favorite wife. But first, you need to understand what Anne Boleyn did to him. The year is 1526. Henry is 35 years old, married to Catherine of Aragon for 17 years. By royal standards, it's a solid marriage. Catherine is respected, intelligent, a capable queen. Then Anne Boleyn returns from France. She's not the most beautiful woman at court. Contemporary sources make that clear. But she has something else. wit that cuts like a blade, intelligence that matches Henry's own, and most dangerously of all, she has the confidence to say no to a king. No one said no to Henry VIII. Anne did it every day. When Henry wanted to make her his mistress, like her sister Mary had been, Anne refused. When he offered her jewels, she sent them back. When he wrote her love letters, she responded with clever riddles that made him work for every word of affection. For 7 years, Anne Boleyn made the King of England chase her like a lovesick boy. Henry broke with Rome, dissolved monasteries, defied the Pope, risked war with Spain, destroyed his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, split England in half, all to marry a woman who kept saying no to him. What kind of love makes a man tear down everything he's built? The desperate kind, the obsessive kind, the kind that doesn't care about consequences because it can't think past the next moment with the person who's driving you mad. Henry didn't just want Anne. He needed her the way drowning men need air. Look at the letters he wrote her. Not the formal royal proclamations, the private ones. The letters where Henry forgets he's a king. I beseech you earnestly to let me know your whole mind as to the love between us two. This isn't how kings write to subjects. This is how desperate men write to women who won't return their calls. But here's what's truly shocking. Even after they married, even after Anne gave him Elizabeth instead of the son he demanded, even after their relationship turned bitter and violent, Henry couldn't let her go. Anne made Henry feel young, made him feel like the golden prince he'd been before the crown grew heavy, made him remember what it felt like to want something just because you wanted it, not because it was politically necessary. But here's the tragic irony. The very thing that made Henry love Anne so completely was the same thing that destroyed her. Her refusal to simply submit and obey. Her insistence on being an equal partner rather than a decorative wife. By 1536, Henry had gotten tired of being challenged. He wanted a queen who said yes. He wanted Jane Seymour's peaceful agreement instead of Anne Boleyn's brilliant arguments.
But Henry could never truly forget Anne. Historians found a letter Henry wrote months after Anne's execution. In it, he admitted that Anne Boleyn was the most happy he'd ever been with any woman. Think about that. He killed the woman who had made him feel most alive, and married the woman who would never make him feel anything dangerous again. But love doesn't die with execution. It just goes underground. That confession Henry wrote about Anne being his most happy time? He never wrote anything like that about any of the other wives. Even from the grave, Anne Boleyn remained the wife Henry couldn't forget. But there's another contender for Henry's heart. One that most people never consider because her story doesn't fit the narrative of passionate love or idealized memory. Katherine Parr, the wife who survived. Here's another twist. Later in this story, we'll ask a bigger question. Was Henry ever truly capable of love at all? Or were his marriages just mirrors of his own needs? July 1543. Henry is 52 years old, bloated from years of rich living. His leg ulcer makes him scream in pain. He's buried 2 wives, divorced 2 others, and beheaded 1. He's tired of the drama of love. Enter Catherine Parr. Catherine isn't young like Catherine Howard had been. She isn't beautiful like Anne Boleyn. She isn't gentle like Jane Seymour. She's something more dangerous to an aging king's heart. She's his equal. Catherine Parr could match Henry in theological debate. She published books under her own name when women weren't supposed to have opinions, let alone publish them. She spoke multiple languages, corresponded with European scholars, and wasn't intimidated by Henry's temper tantrums. Most remarkably of all, she survived them. Watch what happened in 1546. Catherine made the mistake of debating religion with Henry once too often. Conservative courtiers convinced the king that his wife was becoming dangerously Protestant. An arrest warrant was drawn up. Soldiers were sent to bring Catherine to the Tower. Every other wife would have panicked, begged, wept. Catherine Parr did something different. She went to Henry herself, looked him in the eye, and explained that she only debated with him because she enjoyed learning from his superior wisdom, that her questions weren't challenges to his authority, but opportunities for him to teach her. It was brilliant. It gave Henry exactly what his ego needed while making it clear that Catherine was far too clever to be dangerous. Henry tore up the arrest warrant. But here's what really tells us about Henry's feelings for Catherine. Look how he treated her compared to his other wives. Catherine was the only wife Henry let publish books, the only wife he trusted to serve as regent when he went to war in France, the only wife whose opinions he actively sought on matters of state and religion. More telling still, Catherine was the only wife Henry trusted with his children. Not just Edward, his precious heir, but Elizabeth and Mary too, the daughters from his previous marriages. Henry had always struggled with his children. Edward was sickly and serious. Mary was bitter about her mother's treatment. Elizabeth was brilliant, but reminded him too much of Anne Boleyn. Catherine fixed all of that. She became the mother figure Elizabeth had never really had. She convinced Henry to restore both his daughters to the line of succession. She turned Henry's fractured family to something that actually resembled a home. When Henry died in January 1547, he left Catherine the most generous settlement of any of his wives. £7,000 a year for life, multiple properties, jewels. Catherine had done something none of the other wives managed. She had loved him without destroying herself in the process. But here's the question that cuts to the heart of everything. Does the woman who makes you feel peaceful deserve the title of favorite over the woman who made you feel passionate? Does the wife who smoothed your dying years matter more than the wife who defined your youth? The answer depends on what you think love really is.
There's one piece of evidence that settles this debate once and for all. Something Henry did that revealed his true feelings more clearly than any letter or proclamation. When Henry rewrote his will in December 1546, just weeks before his death, he made Catherine Parr his sole executor. Catherine Parr wasn't just Henry's favorite wife. She was the only wife who figured out how to be married to Henry VIII without becoming a victim of Henry VIII.
6 months after Henry's death, Catherine Parr married Thomas Seymour, the man she'd been in love with before Henry claimed her. Although Thomas Seymour wasn't the man she thought he was, Catherine had already proven she didn't need saving. She could write her own ending. She had her own child. She published more books. She lived on her own terms for the first time in years. And when she died in 1548, just 1 year after Henry, she died not as his widow, but as herself. That's the ultimate proof that Catherine Parr was Henry's favorite wife. She understood him well enough to make him happy, but she understood herself well enough never to disappear into his story completely. In a world where being Henry VIII's wife usually meant becoming Henry VIII's victim, Catherine Parr managed to be both his greatest love and her own person. That's not just survival, that's triumph. And that's why, 500 years later, when we ask who Henry VIII really loved most, the answer isn't about Henry at all. It's about the remarkable woman who figured out how to love an impossible man without becoming impossible herself. Catherine Parr, the wife who won by refusing to play the game everyone else lost. But what about you? If you had to choose, which of Henry's wives do you think truly captured his heart? And which one captures yours? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your choice.
And if you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and join me next time as we uncover more secrets of history's most unforgettable queens.